Greetings, traveler of the void. You have entered the domain of void-born terrors. What follows is not a sanctioned transmission. It is a vox thief intercept. A forbidden listening cogitator recording passively inside Station Malleus-Sigma when the sky tore open and the Cicatrix Maledictum swallowed the stars. 912 souls garrisoned that station. We recovered 31 minutes of audio. Secure your Gellar Field. Mark this chronicle with your approval, that the algorithm's machine spirit may know you stand with us. Join the crew. Enlist by subscribing to this archive, and strike the bell of notification, so new transmissions reach you the moment they surface from the static. Every soul who enlists strengthens the beacon. Malleus-Sigma had no beacon at the end. Chapter 1. The First Silence. Dispatch Sergeant Kael Rook. 14th, Iotan Gorgones. 3rd Helical Recon Blade. Vox-log initiated at the personal discretion of the undersigned. This record kept as a formal operational dispatch, in accordance with Tempestus Field Doctrine, subsection 9, paragraph 4. A scion without orders is still a scion with a duty to document. Time of record, uncertain. Station chronometers are disagreeing with one another by margins that should not be physically possible. I am noting this as an anomaly, not as a cause for concern. Not yet. My squad. 6 bodies, all present, all combat capable. Trooper Vask, my second, my best shot. 23 confirmed kills across 3 theaters, and the worst sense of humor in the segmentum. Trooper Gael, devout to the point of exhaustion, recites the litany of the bolter shell before every engagement, including the ones that do not involve bolters, which is all of them. Troopers Derath and Senna, veterans of the Nachman push, the kind of soldiers who do not flinch because they have used up their quota of flinching, and now simply respond. 6 Scions. Station Malleus-Sigma. Population 912. Current status of the 906 who are not us. Unknown. That is why I am logging. The unknown has grown very large, very quickly, and I find that documentation is the only liturgy I trust. Allow me to describe the station as it was, because I suspect it will not be this way for much longer, and someone should remember it accurately before the remembering becomes impossible. Station Malleus-Sigma. A frontier listening post anchored at the trailing edge of the Nachman Gauntlet, the narrow corridor of relatively stable real space that threads between the twin lobes of the Great Rift, what the savants of the Administratum have taken to calling, with the grim poetry that bureaucrats reserve for catastrophes they did not prevent, the Cicatrix Maledictum, the malediction scar. In the common cant of the garrison, the lads and lasses in the lower decks call it the mouth. They mean it as soldiers mean most things, half in jest, half in the bone-deep certainty that the jest is accurate. The station is old, not ancient, not storied, just old in the way that Imperial infrastructure is old, which is to say older than anyone serving aboard it, older than anyone's grandmother serving aboard it, maintained by ritual and supplication rather than engineering, held together by the faith of the Mechanicus and the stubbornness of Plasteel that has forgotten what it was like to be new. The corridors smell of recycled atmosphere, and the ghost of promethium that was spilled in one of the lower conduit junctions, approximately 40 years before my birth, and has never fully purged from the circulation system. The lumen strips in the main transit corridor, Concourse Tertius, running from the docking collar to the administrative block, have been dying by increments since the first month I was posted here. Not flickering precisely, guttering, like candles in a wind you cannot feel but can see moving everything around you. I mention this because tonight, for the first time in 3 years, those lumen strips were burning perfectly. Every strip. Full luminescence, no tremor, no arrhythmic pulse. steady white light the length of Concourse Tertius. Trooper Om was the first to notice. He put his hand on my shoulder, without asking permission, which is his habit, and which I permit him because he is always right when he does it, and said, "Sarge, when did they fix the lights?" They hadn't. I confirmed with the station's maintenance cogitator via the duty vox. No repair orders filed. No mechanicus intervention logged. The strips were simply burning correctly, in defiance of their own failing machine spirits, for no reason that the cogitator could enumerate. I noted it in the log. Anomaly class, minor. Possible cause, voltage surge from the primary plasma conduit. Recommended action, continue patrol. That was my first mistake, categorizing it as minor. In retrospect, I understand that the warp does not begin with screaming. It begins with everything working perfectly. It begins with the lights coming on in a place where the lights have been dying for years. It begins with a silence so complete and correct that you only notice it because something in the oldest part of your brain, the part that remembers when your ancestors huddled in firelight and listened for the sounds of what hunted them, registers the silence as wrong, as the kind of silence that a predator makes when it has finished circling and settled into its final, patient stillness before the strike. The astropath choir had been chanting the evening psalter. This is a thing I need you to understand before I tell you what happened to them, because the evening psalter is not a quiet thing. 12 sanctioned psychers in a warded choir chamber at the station's spinal core, their voices amplified through the resonance coils installed by the Adeptus Astra Telepathica at construction, the harmonics designed to carry meaning across the immaterium to distant relay nodes. The evening psalter fills the entire station. It comes through the ventilation ducts, through the deck plating, through the bones of anyone who stands within 50 meters of the choir chamber. It is a physical fact of existence aboard Malleus-Sigma. You do not hear the evening psalter. You are saturated by it. And then it stopped. Not faded. Not wound down. Stopped. Between one syllable and the next, mid-note, mid-breath, mid-word, the evening psalter ceased. The silence that replaced it was the loudest thing I have ever heard in 23 years of active Scion deployment. It was the silence of a sound that has been generating continuously for 6 standard hours, suddenly finding its absence. It was the silence of 12 human beings simultaneously ceasing to produce the sounds that human beings produce. I had Trooper Darath raise the choir chamber on the vox before the echo of the last note had finished dying. The response was static, not dead static, active static. Something transmitting nothing, but transmitting it with intention. Gael, I said. Litany of warding. She was already reciting it. The Auspex began its malfunction 30 seconds after the choir went silent. I want to be precise about this, because imprecision is how rumors become theology, and theology, in my experience, is what you construct when the facts have become too terrible to name directly. The Auspex did not fail. It did not go dark, did not return garbage data, did not simply cease to function in the way that Imperial equipment ceases to function, which is to say, dramatically, with sparking and the smell of ozone and a machine spirit making its death rattle through the speaker grill. The Auspex continued to function perfectly. It returned coordinates. The coordinates were not wrong in any way that I can quantify using the mathematics available to a Tempestus sergeant. The coordinates were geometrically coherent. They described a point in space. They simply described a point in space that should not be possible to describe, because the number of spatial dimensions required to locate it exceeded the number of spatial dimensions that real space possesses. The cogitator built into my wrist-mounted unit processed the data for exactly 1.4 seconds before displaying a result that I have recorded verbatim into this log. and which I will not repeat aloud here, because Trooper Kael is watching me read it, and she is already frightened, and I will not give her more reason to be. I noted it in the log. Anomaly class. I did not have a classification for this anomaly. I left the field blank. That was approximately 17 seconds before the choir chamber exploded. Exploded is not the correct word, and I am a man who believes in correct words, so I will try again. The choir chamber did not explode outward. It ignited inward. The distinction matters, because an explosion is a physical process with a physical cause, and what happened to 12 sanctioned psychers and the warded chamber that housed them in the final seconds of the evening psalter was not physical in any sense that my training, my experience, or my faith equips me to describe. What I know is what I perceived. What I perceived was this: light. Not the white, steady, wrongly perfect light of the repaired lumen strips. A different light. A light that came from a direction that is not a direction, that cast shadows pointing toward its source rather than away from it, that lasted exactly long enough to burn the inverse of every object in my field of vision onto my retinas as a dark afterimage. What was illuminated in that light, through the Auspex's thermal array, was 12 human shapes in the moment of their unmaking, not burning, transforming, converting. The Adeptus Astra Telepathica train their psychers to contain the warp's hunger, to be vessels for its energy without being consumed by it. And for 6 hours every evening, those 12 men and women had been doing precisely that. Their sanctioned minds, the only barrier between the station's real space bubble and the immaterium pressing against it from every direction. When the Cicatrix Maledictum tore, when the Great Rift expanded, when the warp pushed through a crack in reality so vast that the light of the Astronomicon guttered and died across half the galaxy in the same instant, it did not push through those 12 minds. It pushed from them every prayer, every litany, every word of the evening psalter that had been chanted inside Station Malleus-Sigma across the decades of its operation. All of it had settled into those 12 souls, like silt into a riverbed, layer upon compacted layer. When the rift opened, all of it tried to leave simultaneously. The sound that produced, I have written in my log, that it resembled every prayer ever recited aboard this station, attempting to exit through 12 human mouths at once. Rereading that now, I believe it is accurate. I believe it is also inadequate. I do not have better words. I am sorry. The Gellar shielding shattered 6 seconds later. I know this because the lumen strips went out. Not dark, out. They did not simply cease to emit light. They began to absorb it. The white light of the corridor was drawn into the strips as if by a hunger, and what replaced it was not darkness. Darkness is an absence, a neutral thing, a place where light has not been. What replaced it was something else, a presence that wore darkness the way a void-suited soldier wears their suit. Something inside the not light was watching us breathe. "Squad," I said. "Form on me." And then we were somewhere else. 3 seconds. I timed it from the vox-log recording, and it was exactly 3 seconds. And in those 3 seconds, the 6 of us, Rook, Vask, Kael, Darath, Senna, were standing in sunlight. Not the station. Not Malleus-Sigma. A field. A real field. Soil beneath our boots. Actual soil with the smell of turned earth, and something growing in it. The sky above us, the blue of a world with weather, with clouds, with a star close enough to warm the skin. Vask, who does not startle easily, made a sound that I have never heard her make before, and which I will not describe because it belongs to her. Kael dropped to her knees. And Darath turned back to back by instinct, weapons raised, scanning a horizon that had grass in it. I knew what it was. The warp had reached into the oldest chambers of 6 human brains and retrieved the thing most desperately wanted. 6 Scions, standing in the place their particular nervous systems had elected to call home in the half-second before the horror registered. Vask's home smelled like engine oil and hot metal. She grew up in a forge hive. The field was not her memory. The field was something wearing our memories as a coat. 3 seconds, and then we were back in the corridor, in the absorbed darkness, in the station, and Trooper Gael was still on her knees on the deck plating, but she was still reciting the litany of warding, and I took that as the most professional thing I have witnessed in 23 years of service, and I noted it formally in the log. On your feet, Gael. She rose. All of you, weapons free, form column, we move for the central armory. On point. Vask, rear. Where are we going? Darath asked. A fair question. We're finding out if anyone else is still breathing, I said. And if they aren't, we're finding out what made them stop. It was Vask who caught the Vox transmission, 20 seconds into our move down Concourse Tertius, the darkness absorbing the beam of her shoulder lumen as fast as it was cast, and giving us approximately 3 meters of visibility in every direction. She put her fist up. We halted. She held the Vox receiver to her ear, and her face did something I had not seen Vask's face do since the second Nachmund push. It went blank. Not controlled, not professional. Blank. The way a face goes blank when it has received information that it does not yet know what to do with. Sarge, she said. Command bunker is transmitting. Put it through. The voice that came through the Vox receiver was Colonel Commissar Vile Drust. His voice exactly. The dry authority of it. The Cadian inflection he had never quite lost, despite 20 years commanding a Nachmund frontier post. The slight hesitation before tactical assessments that I had catalogued over 3 years as the tell that preceded his best decisions. His encryption code, fed into the receiver's authenticator, returned, verified, command authority, Colonel Commissar Vale Drust. He was giving an after-action report, a calm, detailed, lucidly professional after-action report, about an engagement that had not yet occurred. The timestamp embedded in the transmission's data packet, the timestamp that the station's own cogitator system had authenticated and logged before routing the signal to our unit, read as follows: 4 days, 7 hours, and 43 minutes from the moment I was standing in that corridor listening to it. A transmission from the future, from the command bunker, from a man whose voice I recognized, and whose encryption codes were verified, and whose calm, professional assessment of an engagement that had not yet happened described, among other things, the exact position I was standing in, the exact direction I was facing, and the exact words I would say when I heard his voice. I said them anyway. I don't know why. Rook here. Confirm receipt. The transmission ended. In the absorbed darkness of Concourse Tertius, with 6 boots on the deck plating, and 6 sets of lungs breathing recycled air that tasted of promethium and old prayers, I stood still for a moment that I did not log. Because some moments are not data, they are simply the place where data stops and the thing beneath data begins. And then I updated my assessment of anomaly class on everything I had logged in the past 4 minutes. I changed them all to unknown, threat level, existential, recommended action, survive. Move, I said. We moved. Chapter 2. The Cartography of Meat. Dispatch Sergeant Kael Rook. Second log. Operational status. 6 Scions mobile. 0 casualties. 0 contact. I am choosing to record that as a victory, because in the next sentence, I have to describe what the station is doing to itself, and I want 1 sentence of victory before I do. The station is being rebuilt. Not collapsing, not deteriorating in the expected fashion of a structure whose Gellar shielding has failed. I have trained for that. I know what catastrophic real space collapse looks like. Bulkheads buckling inward as void pressure differentials do physics to them, atmosphere venting through compromised seals, the screaming of metal under forces it was not designed to resist. I have a protocol for that. The protocol is, seal your rebreather, find the emergency evacuation corridor, transmit distress, survive. I do not have a protocol for a station that is quietly, methodically, with apparent purpose, rearranging itself according to a geometry that does not correspond to any blueprint on record. We discovered it on the third corridor junction, past the choir chamber ruins. The junction should have led left to the primary armory, right to the commissary block, and straight ahead to the central lifter shafts connecting all 9 deck levels. I know this because I have walked that junction approximately 400 times in 3 years of posting. My boots know that junction. My feet carry the memory of it in the angle of my stride. The armory corridor was gone. Not blocked, gone. The left-hand passage had sealed itself, not with a bulkhead or a blast door, but with a wall. Plasteel and ceramite that had flowed like cooling promethium into the space where the corridor had been, filling it flush, smooth, and unmarked, as if the corridor had never existed, as if the station's architecture had simply decided to stop remembering it. I pressed my gauntlet against the surface. It was warm, not the ambient warmth of heated metalwork. Warm in the way that living things are warm, carrying heat from some internal source. "Vask," I said. Auspex reading on the sealed section. She ran it. She ran it twice. She showed me the screen without saying anything, which is how Vask communicates information that she would prefer not to be the one to say aloud. The Auspex was reading the sealed wall as hollow. The hollow space beyond it was the exact dimensions of the armory corridor, and inside that hollow space, arranged in the positions of soldiers on patrol, were 6 heat signatures. 6. The size of a Scion squad. The size of our squad. I told the squad to keep moving, and I did not tell them what the Auspex had shown me. We moved for the central lifter shafts, by the only route remaining, straight ahead, and I noted in the log that the station was apparently beginning to mirror us, and that I did not yet know what that meant, and that I was going to treat it as a threat until I had evidence that it was not. The evidence, when it arrived, confirmed the threat. It always does. The lifter shaft concourse was intact. I will give the warp that small concession. The lift mechanisms themselves still functioned. Their counterweights and cable systems apparently too mechanically fundamental to be reimagined into something else. We took the shafts to Deck 4, the garrison level, where the bulk of the station's 906 non-Scion personnel were quartered. It was the logical first search zone. It was where the living, if living remained, would have sheltered. The smell reached us before the doors opened. Ozone, yes. The universal smell of warp bleed, of reality leaking, of the immaterium pressing its chemistry through the membrane of real space. But beneath the ozone, something organic. Not blood. I know blood, the copper iron smell of it, and this was adjacent to that smell without being it. Something more complex. The smell of biological material and industrial material having reached a compromise with each other. Of flesh and plasteel arriving, through processes I do not have the biochemistry to describe, at a mutual understanding. The lifter doors opened. I looked at Deck 4. I did not log my immediate response. Some responses are not for the record. The garrison quarters ran the length of Deck 4 in 2 parallel blocks. 400 bunks per block, 800 souls, arranged with the efficient compression of Imperial military architecture, which is to say, enough space to sleep in, enough space to stand next to the bunk while sleeping, and nothing further. The corridor between the two blocks was 3 meters wide and ran for 60 meters to the communal mess at the far end. The walls of that corridor were no longer walls. Along the full length of both sides, at chest height, hands protruded from the plasteel. Not through it, from it, emerging from the surface of the wall as if the wall had grown them, as if plasteel and human tissue had been pressed together under enormous heat and pressure until the boundary between them dissolved. The hands were in an attitude of warding, palms out, fingers spread, the universal gesture of something attempting to stop what is coming. The gesture of someone who saw what was approaching and raised their hands, because hands were all they had. There were, I counted as I walked the corridor, and I counted because counting is what you do when looking directly at something becomes impossible. 143 pairs of hands. Some still wore the remnants of garrison uniform at the wrist. Some had the markings of long service, the calluses of weapon drills, the scar tissue of previous deployments, the tattoos of regimental devotion. All of them were warm. I did not touch them. Trooper Durath walking behind me did, instinctively, reflexively, the same impulse that makes a soldier check a fallen comrade for a pulse. He touched the back of one hand and pulled his fingers away and said nothing for a long time. Then he said quietly, to no one in particular, "Still warm, they're still there." I logged it. I kept walking. I noted that Trooper Durath's hands were shaking and that his combat effectiveness rating should be considered provisionally reduced, and that I was not going to say this to him because there are forms of truth that serve no operational purpose in the moment of their utterance. Behind me, Gael was whispering. The litany of the departed. The one recited for soldiers who have died but whose bodies cannot be recovered. I thought that was probably the correct liturgical choice under the circumstances, and I did not correct her. We found Trooper Vask's ammunition situation in the communal mess. She had been running drills on her hotshot las pistol since we cleared the lifter. Function checks, charge verification, the rituals of a soldier who processes fear through maintenance. When she went to reload the backup magazine for her primary weapon, she stopped walking. She stopped so suddenly that Om walked into her from behind. She held the magazine out to me. I took it. I ejected it slowly, the way you handle something that has already demonstrated it intends to surprise you. The rounds were wrong. The propellant casings were intact. The brass housings, the primer caps, the geometry of Imperial standard hotshot ammunition, unchanged on the outside. But the interior mass was not propellant. I could tell because one of the casings had cracked along its seam during whatever process had altered it, and through the crack I could see what had replaced the propellant charge, the calcified white of old bone, human molars, still attached to fragments of jawbone, compressed into the space where the explosive charge should have been. The crack was wide enough that I could see the roots of the teeth, long, curved, the kind of root structure that speaks to decades of growth inside a living skull. I went through the rest of the magazine. 22 rounds, 22 casings containing what had been propellant and was now bone. In 3 cases, the teeth were still seated in fragments of jaws large enough that I could see where they met other teeth. The partial topography of someone's mouth, miniaturized, compressed, and loaded into a weapon. When Vask tried to eject the magazine fully, the teeth chattered. The sound lasted approximately 1 second and was perfectly, mechanically rhythmic. Not the random clicking of loose objects in a metal container, but the deliberate cadence of a jaw working, opening and closing, biting at nothing. "Drop the magazine," I said. She dropped it. "Draw your blade." She drew it. I noted in the log that Trooper Vask was to be considered operating with reduced ranged capability, and that I was revising our engagement doctrine accordingly. I did not note the sound the teeth made when they hit the deck plating, and continued, briefly, to chatter against the metal before going still. I did not note it because I did not want to read it back later. I did not want to read it back later because I suspected that later, if we had a later, would already have enough things in it. The cargo servitors were in Bay 7, 6 of them, hulking industrial units, their frames built for bulk haulage, their bodies a decades-old collaboration between human flesh and mechanical augmentation. Lobotomized at the point of their conscription into service, their higher cognitive functions were removed with the precision of mechanicus surgery and replaced with a simple tasking architecture: lift, carry, stack, repeat. They had been doing this, lifting, carrying, stacking, repeating, for somewhere between 15 and 30 years each, depending on the unit. Their machine spirits had been shaped entirely by the weight of cargo containers and the rhythm of the loading crane. The warp had given them back everything that had been taken. We heard them before we saw them. The sound coming through the cargo bay's blast doors was a sound I do not have adequate precedent for. 6 voices, human voices, in the full register of human distress, speaking over and under and through each other in the cacophony of people who have been given language back after a very long silence and are using all of it simultaneously. Names. They were saying names. Their own names I understood after a moment, repeating them like prayers, like incantations, like a man who has forgotten something essential is trying to remember it by saying it louder. Marin. I am Marin. My name is Marin. There was someone, Where is this? Where is this? What is this? I remember. I opened the blast door. They turned toward the sound. 6 industrial servitor frames, their augmetic limbs and their optical lenses, and their hydraulic torso housings, and inside all of that machinery the faces, the original faces, the ones that had been present at the surgery that made them what they were, contorted in the full animal expressiveness of people experiencing terror and grief and total disorientation simultaneously. One of them, Marin presumably, reached toward me with a hauling claw that could have compacted the claw into a sphere of crushed metal if it chose, and said in a voice that had clearly not been used for speaking in 15 years, "Please, please, I don't. Please tell me where." She did not finish the sentence. The grief of what she was, what they had been made into, what they had been for 15 or 30 years, what they had been doing in that cargo bay, day after day after day, without the cognitive architecture to know it, crossed her face, and she screamed. And the scream broke something in the other 5, and they came at us. Not with aggression. I want to be precise about this. They came with the blind, crashing momentum of creatures in pain, seeking the only things in their field of perception that registered as other, as outside, as something that existed separate from the anguish that was now the entire content of their restored consciousness. They did not want to hurt us. They wanted to not be what they were. They came at us because we were there and they had nowhere else to go. I gave the order. I gave it in the same register I use for all orders. Flat, declarative, the voice of operational necessity. And my squad executed it with the professionalism I have come to rely on, and to feel, in moments like this one, as a kind of terrible grace. It was over in 11 seconds. 6 servitor frames. 11 seconds. I logged 6 names. Marin. The other 5 I had to infer from the voice patterns on the Vox recording, cross-referencing against the station's servitor conscription manifest, which I accessed from Vask's wrist cogitator. I found 4 matches. 2 of the names I could not recover. I logged them as unknown with the notation formerly human, station cargo complement, which is the best I could do, and which I know is not enough, and which I know they would not have wanted, but which is all the record I have to offer them. I did not log how long I stood in Bay 7 after the squad had moved to the door. I did not log what I said, quietly, before I followed them. Some things are between a soldier and the Emperor, and if the Emperor is listening from behind a warp-swallowed sky, then he can log it himself. Trooper Senna died at the junction of Deck 4 and the upper maintenance duct network. I am going to describe this precisely because Senna deserves precision. She deserves the full operational record, not an elision, not a euphemism, not the comfortable ambiguity of lost in the field. She was 26 years old. She had survived the Nakmund push, the Ghoul Star's border action, and the second siege of Vralos IV. She was afraid of interior spaces, a claustrophobia she had never disclosed, and which I had always known about, and had always scheduled her for corridor duty rather than duct clearance for 3 years without making her explain why. She was the best knife fighter in the squad. She had a pendant of the Aquila that she touched before every engagement, and afterward, briefly, with a relief so private she thought no one saw it. I saw it every time. The gravity inversion lasted 4 seconds. There was no warning, no atmospheric change, no Auspex signal, no sound. The local gravity field in a 3-meter radius simply inverted, flipped its orientation 180 degrees in the span of time it takes to blink, and Senna, who was standing in that radius, went upward at a velocity that I calculate from the sound of the impact was fatal before she reached the ceiling. The ceiling was 4 meters above the deck. She reached it in the time it takes to exhale. The ceiling did not release her. The gravity field restabilized around her at the ceiling's surface, and she became part of the architecture, the way the garrison soldiers had become part of the walls, and the station held her there, and I could not reach her. I stood beneath her for 7 seconds. I know it was 7 because I counted. Then I logged her name, her rank, her service number, her campaign history, and the note that she was owed a commendation for the Ghoul Star's action that had never been formally processed through the administratum, and that I was processing it now, effective immediately, with all the authority I had as her commanding officer, which in this moment felt like a very small amount of authority, and like the only thing left I could give her. "Form up," I said. We moved for the upper transit decks. The Auspex gave me the last reading of this log as we cleared Deck 4's aft stairwell. I had been running passive sweeps every 90 seconds, a habit, a discipline, the background rhythm of tactical awareness that keeps you alive long enough to be killed by something worth being killed by. The 90-second mark came. I ran the sweep, 1 contact, moving, inside the maintenance ductwork above our current position, using the full network of the station's intestinal infrastructure as a transit route, moving with a speed and a confidence that spoke of something that had learned the ductwork's geography faster than its designers had intended. Moving in a pattern that, when I overlaid it on the station's blueprint, described a loose perimeter around our squad's position. Not an attack vector, a watching distance, the careful, unhurried orbit of something that is not yet ready to close in, but is making sure we cannot leave without its knowledge. I ran the Auspex identification query. The query returned the only information that the station's identification system had for the contact. Command staff, all present. I showed it to no one. I pocketed the Auspex. I noted it in the log as anomaly class, unknown. Threat level, primary. Recommended action, reach the command bunker before the command staff do. Double time, I said. We ran. Chapter 3. Litanies for the Already Dead. Dispatch Sergeant Kael Rook. 3rd log. Operational status. 4 Scions mobile, 2 casualties. I'm going to say that again because the log requires it, and because saying it twice is the only ritual I have left for the dead when there is no time for the proper ones. 2 casualties. Trooper Sen, Trooper Derath, lost in the aft stairwell during our run from Deck 4. I will return to Derath in a moment, when I have the words for it, when I have found the compartment in my operational mind where I am going to store what happened to him so that it does not interfere with my ability to function. I have not found that compartment yet. I am still looking. In the meantime, I am logging. 4 Scions: Rook, Vask, Gael, Station Malleus-Sigma, population unknown. Current status of the 908 who are not us. I am beginning to develop a theory, and the theory is the most frightening thing I have encountered in 23 years of service, which is a sentence I did not expect to be writing tonight, and which I suspect will not be the last sentence of that type before this log concludes. We have reached Deck 6, the observation tier. I chose it because the observation tier has the widest corridors on the station, which means the fewest choke points, which means the entity moving through the ductwork above us has fewer optimal positions from which to... I will stop that sentence here because Gael is close enough to read over my shoulder, and I need her reciting the litany of warding, not processing tactical threat assessments. The litany of warding. She has not stopped. In 47 minutes of continuous movement through a station that is becoming something other than a station, Trooper Gael has not missed a single word of the litany of warding. I have been counting, not the words. I know the litany of warding by rote, every Scion does, counting the cycles. She is on her 31st repetition. I have said nothing about it because her voice is the only consistent sound in a station that has otherwise gone acoustically wrong, and because the litany of warding is, in the technical field doctrine of the Adeptus Ministorum, a legitimate tactical asset in environments with confirmed warp bleed, and because the truth is that I find it easier to breathe when she is reciting it, and I am not going to examine that truth any more closely than I have to. Is watching the ductwork grates. He has been watching them since Deck 4. He has not said anything since Deck 4. This is unusual for who in normal operational circumstances maintains a running commentary on everything in his field of vision as a mechanism for staying alert, and whose silence I am reading as either profound professionalism or profound terror, and who I am not going to ask about it, because either answer is equally useless to me right now. I will tell you about Derath. The aft stairwell on Deck 4 connects to the upper transit corridor via a half landing, a platform approximately 2 meters square, with a 90-degree turn left and then 8 more steps to the transit level. Standard Imperial construction. I have used it hundreds of times. I was 12 steps ahead of Derath when I heard him stop. Not fall. Stop. The cessation of boot sound on metal stairwell grating is a distinct acoustic event, and this was that event, the deliberate, chosen cessation of forward movement, and I turned back. Derath was standing on the half landing. He was looking at the wall of the half landing, which in the station's original construction was plain ceramite, unpainted, unadorned, the utilitarian blankness of Imperial infrastructure that does not waste ornamentation on a stairwell, had become something else. I do not know when. I do not know how long it had been becoming, whether it had transformed in the seconds we were moving through the stairwell, or whether it had been in this state for hours and we were only now seeing it. The wall was covered in writing, not scratched into the surface, not applied with any pigment I could identify. Grown. The letters emerged from the ceramite itself, raised from the surface like scar tissue from healed skin, in a script that shifted between High Gothic and something that used the characters of High Gothic as raw material for an alphabet I had never encountered. Some sections were clearly legible, others were legible for one reading and different on the second. One section, A column of text running floor to ceiling along the left-hand edge of the wall appeared to be in a language that I could read individual words of. Throne, mercy, below already, but which refused to form into sentences that maintained meaning when the eye moved from one word to the next. Derath was reading it. This is the thing I cannot put in the correct compartment. He was reading it. The posture was unmistakably that, the slight forward lean, the stillness of someone processing written information, the movement of his lips that could have been sub-vocalizing text. I called his name. He did not respond. I called it again. I moved back down the stairs to the half landing and put my hand on his shoulder and said his name at the volume I use for orders in loud environments. He turned around. His eyes were closed. They had been closed the whole time. He said, in a voice that was his voice in every tonal quality, but which was delivering the words with a cadence that did not belong to him, that belonged to something speaking through a medium that had not been designed for speech. He already knows how it ends. He told you. You confirmed receipt. Then he opened his eyes and blinked twice, and he was Derath again, fully, suddenly, with the slight frown of a man who has missed a step in a conversation. And he said, "Sarge, why are we stopped?" I looked at his eyes, both present, both tracking, pupils responding to my lumen. "We're moving," I said. "Stairwell, go." He went. I followed him. I noted in the log that Trooper Derath had experienced a brief, dissociative episode of probable warp origin, that his combat effectiveness was to be considered provisionally reduced, and that I had elected to continue integrating him into the squad's tactical structure, because removing him from it would require an explanation I did not have time to give. Derath died 11 minutes later in the upper transit corridor. He was not the last to die, but he was the first to go without knowing what was happening to him, and I find that I cannot decide whether that is a mercy or the worst part, and I have been trying to decide for 20 minutes, and I am going to stop trying now and concentrate on the living. I will write his commendation when we reach defensible ground. The observation tier's viewport corridor is the longest unbroken stretch of hull window on the station. 40 meters of reinforced armor glass, 3 meters high, looking out into the void that Malleus-Sigma occupies at the edge of the Nachmund Gauntlet. It is, under normal operational conditions, one of the most disorienting places on the station to spend time, because the gauntlet itself is visually complex. Gravitational lensing effects from the competing masses of the rift's twin lobes, bending the star field into shapes that the human visual cortex was not designed to process comfortably. The light of distant stars arriving at angles that make them appear to orbit each other. The general impression that space in this region has been folded once too often and never quite unfolded properly. Under current operational conditions, the viewport corridor is something else. We entered it from the port access hatch, moving in column, on point, at T plus 41 minutes. Stopped. He raised his fist. We stopped. Then slowly, he lowered his fist and simply stood, and I moved up beside him, and I looked through the armor glass, and I understood why he had no tactical response to offer. There was no void outside. The void, the stars, the bent light of the gauntlet, the distant luminescence of the system's primary, all of the physical content of the space that Malleus-Sigma was anchored in, was gone. What the viewport showed instead was the warp itself, not the warp bleed that was saturating the station's interior, not the localized phenomenon of a compromised Gellar Field, the warp proper. The immaterium in its full unmediated expression, pressing against the outside of the armor glass, with the casual enormity of an ocean pressing against the hull of a vessel that has sunk. The warp does not look like space. I want to record this accurately because I do not think many people have looked at the warp directly through armor glass and survived to log it and the record should exist somewhere. The warp is luminescent in a way that does not obey the physics of luminescence. The light does not have sources, it simply exists, permeating a medium that is simultaneously denser than promethium and less substantial than thought. It moves, not with the movement of weather or water, but with the movement of something that has intentions, that is going somewhere specific and knows the way. It is the color of every color simultaneously, which in practice means it is the color of none of them, which in practice means it is the color of the space behind your eyes when you press on them in darkness. And it was full of faces. I counted, because counting is my liturgy, my way of staying in the rational, the innumerable, the world where things can be catalogued and therefore survived. I counted 14 distinct faces visible through the armor glass before I made myself stop counting. They were pressed against the outside of the viewport, the way faces press against glass when the person behind the glass is desperate, and the glass is the only barrier between them and something worse than where they are. They were in the attitudes of people who have been in water too long, the bloated, attenuated distortion of flesh that has been subject to pressures it was not designed to withstand. But they were recognizable. Trooper Vask beside me made a sound that was not a word. The face in the center of the viewport, the largest, the most clearly defined, the one that the warp seemed to be offering most deliberately, the way a current deposits something specific on a shore, was the face of a man in the uniform of the Imperial Guard. The rank insignia were those of a captain. The regimental marking on the collar was the 14th Iotan Gorgones. The face was one I had not seen in 11 years, which is how long it has been since Captain Edris Yoon, my first commanding officer, died in a rearguard action on the second moon of Kephorus IV. His body left in territory that was subsequently lost to the enemy and never recovered. He was mouthing something. The warp pressed his face against the armor glass, and his lips moved with the careful exaggeration of someone who knows they cannot be heard and is trying to compensate with precision. I read lips passably well, a Scion skill, useful in loud environments. I read his. He was mouthing a tactical order, a specific tactical order, not a general command, not a prayer, a tactical order with unit designations and positional references and an objective marker, an order for this corridor, this situation, these 4 remaining Scions, an order that would, if executed, move us away from the viewport and into the maintenance junction at the corridor's far end, which the station's blueprint placed adjacent to. I cross-referenced on Vask's wrist cogitator, the secondary broadcast array housing. I stood and watched my dead commanding officer's face against the armor glass of a station consumed by the warp, and I made a decision that I am recording here so that anyone who reviews this log can assess my reasoning and determine whether it was sound or whether I had, by this point, simply lost the ability to distinguish between tactical intelligence and warp taint-induced hallucination. I executed the order. Column. Maintenance junction, far end of the corridor. Move. Vask looked at me. I looked back. She moved. The maintenance junction smelled of something that had once been machine oil and was now in the process of becoming something with a pulse. The junction itself, a 4-meter square access hub connecting the observation tier's environmental systems to the upper duct network, was intact in its structural dimensions, but had undergone the same qualitative transformation as everything else on Deck 6. The surfaces were warm, the metal had taken on the slightly uneven texture of flesh seen from a distance, and the cogitator terminal mounted on the east wall was running a process that its screen described as Litany compilation in high Gothic script that scrolled too fast to read and which smelled inexplicably of incense. Gael stopped reciting the litany of warding when she saw the screen. The silence was enormous. I had not realized how much of my own composure had been anchored to the sound of her voice until it stopped. "Gael," I said, quietly. She started again. 30-second repetition. I breathed. Found the first of the fusion zones in the maintenance junction's access corridor, a narrow passage running north toward the environmental systems housing, 3 meters long, wide enough for one person moving sideways. The walls of this passage had merged with the people who had been standing in it. Not all of them. Not completely. The warp bleed had advanced unevenly here, the way infection advances unevenly through compromised tissue, progressing fastest where the resistance was lowest and leaving pockets of the original intact between the consumed sections. What this meant, in the access corridor, was a passage in which segments of normal wall alternated with segments of wall from which human beings protruded to varying degrees of completion. Some were hands only. The garrison quarter hands repeated here, palms out, the supplication gesture, warm. Some were further. Shoulders the curve of a neck, a profile embedded in plasteel to the depth of an ear. At the midpoint of the passage, a man I identified from the upper body insignia as a senior rating of the station's environmental crew was present from the waist up, both arms free, his hands flat against the wall on either side of him, in the posture of someone who had tried to push themselves free and had been pushing ever since. His face was turned toward the access corridor's entry point. His eyes were open and tracking. He looked at me. I looked at him. "Can you hear me?" I said. Not a question. I said it the way you say a thing that you need to say, regardless of the answer. His mouth opened. The sound that came out was not a voice. The mechanism of voice requires the full respiratory apparatus, and whatever he was connected to now had changed the nature of his lungs. But it was intentional. It was shaped. It was, I understood after a moment of processing it, the closest approximation available to him of the word yes. "I'm going to get you out," I said. "I am recording this so that the record shows I said it. I am also recording what I said 20 seconds later, after Vask had examined the fusion point where his torso disappeared into the wall and had shown me the Auspex reading of what lay on the other side of that wall, which was the wall's entire internal structure, 300 millimeters of load-bearing plasteel and conduit housing, completely occupied by the biological material of the station's crew, compressed and integrated to a density that no extraction procedure available to 4 Scions with combat blades and a partial charge on their laser guns could address. "I can't," I said. "I'm sorry." He looked at me. His eyes did not change their expression, which was the expression of someone who had already known and had simply needed to hear it said by someone else. I gave him the Aquila, 2 fingers pressed to my sternum, the gesture of Imperial faith, the acknowledgement that his service was witnessed and recorded in a ledger more permanent than mine. He returned it, with the hand that was free, in a movement that cost him something I will not try to measure. I logged his name from the insignia. Crewman Senior Alast Porin, Environmental Systems, Deck 6, 12 years of service. I will write his commendation alongside Dirath's when we reach defensible ground. I moved the squad through the access corridor without telling them to not look. They are Scions. They looked, and they kept moving, and they did not make sounds that I had to respond to. And that is a form of grace that I will also record. It was in the maintenance junction's east access, 20 minutes later, that I received the second transmission from the command bunker. The Vox clicked twice, the authentication handshake, and then Colonel Commissar Drust's voice, dry and certain and utterly calm, began his second after-action report. This one was more specific than the first. It described by name the deaths of troopers Dirath and Senna, accurately, in precise operational detail, including the stairwell half-landing and the gravity inversion at the Deck 4 junction. It described Crewman Senior Porrin in the access corridor, including the exact words I had said to him and his response. It described our current position in the maintenance junction to within 2 meters. And then it continued forward, into the events that had not yet occurred. And it described, in the same dry, certain professional voice, the manner in which each of my remaining 3 squad members would die before this log concluded. I sat with the Vox receiver pressed against my ear and I listened to all of it. I did not look at my squad. I did not change my expression. Vask was watching me, because Vask always watches me when the Vox activates, and I met her eyes once and held them long enough to communicate that nothing in my expression should be read as information, and she accepted that and looked away. The transmission ended. The colonel asked me to confirm receipt. "Rook here," I said. "Confirmed." The line went dead. I sat for 11 seconds, I counted, in the maintenance junction of a dying station, with 3 living soldiers in my care, and I processed what I had just heard. Not the content, the structure. Because the colonel's transmission was not a prophecy. Prophecy is the domain of sanctioned psychers and the Astronomicon, and things I do not have clearance to contemplate. What the colonel's transmission was, I now understood, was a plan. Not a recording of what would happen, a prescription for what should happen, a document generated by something that wanted specific events to occur in a specific sequence, and which had chosen to present that document as the voice of military authority because it understood that military authority was the thing most likely to produce compliance in a tempestuous scion. I have received the receipt twice now. I had not, either time, agreed to comply. I stood up. "Change of route," I said. "We're not taking the upper transit corridor. Vask, you know the secondary maintenance bypass on this deck?" She frowned. "The one that's not on the standard blueprint. The one that Crewman Senior Porrin showed me during the environmental inspection tour, last rotation." I did not look at the access corridor when I said his name. It runs parallel to the upper transit corridor and comes out 50 meters closer to the broadcast array. That route puts us through the warp bleed saturation zone around the choir chamber ruins. "Yes," I said. The colonel's transmission specified the upper transit corridor. "I know." A pause. "You're doing it on purpose," Vask said. "Not a question." "I'm doing it on purpose," I confirmed. "Move." The warp bleed saturation zone around the choir chamber ruins was exactly what it sounds like, and worse than what it sounds like, and we moved through it in column at double pace, with Gale reciting at full voice, and running the auspex hot. And I am going to record what we saw in it, because the record requires it, and because Captain Yon, the dead version of him, the warp-pressed version, the one mouthing tactical orders through armor glass, gave me this route, and I think he gave it to me because it was the only route the colonel's plan had not accounted for. And I think that means he was in whatever capacity remained available to someone pressing their face against the membrane of the immaterium, still on my side. The air in the saturation zone tasted of copper and old prayers, and something sweet beneath both that I recognized after a moment as the smell of the candles that the choir burned during the evening psalter. The walls were the deep amber of plasteel that has been exposed to sustained psychic energy, not damaged, not melted, but altered in the way that exposure to intense heat changes the temper of metal. A fundamental molecular adjustment that the material carries permanently. Every surface was warm. The warmth was uneven, some sections hotter, some barely above ambient, in the pattern of residual energy dispersing through a medium, the last echoes of 12 simultaneous detonations still radiating outward through the station's bones. The choir chamber itself was sealed, not by a bulkhead or a blast door, by the same plasteel flow process that had sealed the armory corridor on Deck 4, the station's architecture digesting the site of the detonation, and incorporating it into its own restructured geometry. Through the sealed wall I could hear something. Not sound exactly, a subacoustic resonance, felt in the sternum more than heard by the ear, with the rhythm and periodicity of a heartbeat running at approximately half the speed of a human resting pulse. The choir chamber had a heartbeat. I did not stop to investigate. I logged it and kept moving, and noted in the log that whatever was generating that pulse was doing so at a consistent rate, and that consistency in warp phenomena is either very good news or the worst possible news, and that I did not yet know which. We cleared the saturation zone in 6 minutes. No casualties, no contact from the entity in the ductwork, which was either because the secondary bypass was not on its map or because it was allowing us to proceed. And I noted both possibilities in the log with equal threat ratings, because I have learned today that generosity in this station is not a thing to be trusted. The secondary bypass deposited us in the service corridor, adjacent to the broadcast array housing, 50 meters closer than the upper transit corridor would have managed, and the array housing's blast door was intact, and its cogitator terminal was functioning, and the charge remaining on the station's primary Vox transmitter was, according to the terminal's readout, sufficient for one high-powered burst transmission of approximately 90 seconds duration. 90 seconds. Enough to say what needed saying. Enough to tell anyone within range what had happened here, and what was happening still, and what it meant for every vessel in the Nachman Gauntlet, and every station along the rift's edge. Enough to warn them. "Vask," I said, "can you get into the transmitter housing and prep the burst protocol? Give me 6 minutes. You have 4. I looked at Om. He was still watching the ductwork grates, had been watching them for an hour without stopping, without comment, with the focused stillness of a man who has decided that the watching is the only job that matters. What are you seeing?" He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, without taking his eyes off the nearest grate, "It's been pacing us since Deck 4. Whatever's in the ducts. It matches our speed exactly. Stops when we stop. Moves when we move." A pause. "It's not hunting us, Sarge. What is it doing?" Another pause. Longer. "I think it's waiting for us to finish something." I looked at the blast door of the broadcast array housing. I looked at Vask's hands moving over the transmitter housing with the speed and precision of a Scion who has been cross-trained in Vox equipment and who is, right now, the most important person in the Nachman Gauntlet. "Then let's finish it," I said. Kael recited. I watched. Vask worked. Above us, in the ducts, something patient settled its weight and waited. Chapter 4. The Fighting Retreat. Dispatch Sergeant Kael Rook. 4th log. Operational status. 2 Scions mobile. I'm going to say the names before I say anything else, because the names come first. Because the names are the thing that separates a casualty report from a body count. And I will not have this log be a body count. Trooper Om. 14 years of service. 3 theaters. The running commentary that I always pretended to find irritating, and which was, I understand now, the sound of a soldier staying alive through sheer force of engagement with the world around him, noticing everything, naming everything, refusing to let anything exist unnamed in his vicinity, because unnamed things are the things that kill you in the dark. He named everything. He named it right up until he couldn't. Trooper Kael, 9 years of service, 37 continuous repetitions of the litany of warding across 91 minutes of active engagement in a warp-saturated environment. 37. I counted everyone. Her voice was the only consistent true thing in this station from the moment the choir chamber detonated, and I am recording that formally in the operational log, so that the Adeptus Ministorum, If the Adeptus Ministorum still exists in functional form beyond the borders of what the Cicatrix Maledictum has swallowed, which I do not know and am choosing not to calculate, is aware that Trooper Gael of the 14th Iotan Gorgon held the line with her voice when everything else had failed, and that this constitutes, in my professional assessment, an act of extraordinary valor under conditions of warp engagement, and that she is owed a commendation that I am filing now, effective this moment, which may be the last moment I have for filing. 2 Scions, Rook and Vask, moving for the command bunker. Distance, 140 meters of corridor that is no longer entirely a corridor. Time, unknown. The station's chronometers have stopped disagreeing with each other. They have simply stopped, all of them, simultaneously, which I am logging as either a system failure or a statement. I am going to describe what happened at the broadcast array housing, because the log requires it, and because and Gael deserve to have what happened to them described accurately and completely, and because there is a part of me that believes, without the theological scaffolding to justify the belief, on pure operational instinct, that the more precisely I describe what is happening here, the more real it remains. And the more real it remains, the more it belongs to the world of things that can be survived. I am aware this may not be sound reasoning. I am logging it anyway. Vask got the burst transmitter prepped in 3 minutes and 50 seconds, which was 10 seconds under my deadline, which is the kind of performance that I have come to expect from her, and which I am recording explicitly because she will not record it herself. Vask does not document her own competence, on the grounds that competence should be self-evident, and documentation of the obvious is a waste of vox-log storage capacity. I disagree. I document everything. This is one of our longest-standing arguments. We will not resolve it today. The burst protocol required a manual authentication sequence. 6 alphanumeric codes entered in sequence into the transmitter's cogitator terminal, derived from the duty officer's cipher sheet, which Vask did not have. She bypassed the authentication sequence in the remaining 10 seconds, using a method that she told me afterward she had learned from a signals trooper during the Ghoul Stars action, and which involved a combat blade, the transmitter housing's secondary access panel, and a philosophical willingness to void the machine spirit's warranty. The machine spirit, to its credit, cooperated. The transmitter hummed to life with the deep, bone-resonating thrum of a Vox array charging to full broadcast capacity. 90 seconds. Vask looked at me. I looked at the active transmitter. "You want to do it?" she asked. "Yes." I stepped to the terminal. I opened the log I had been maintaining since this began. I read from it directly. Not a summary, not an interpretation. The raw operational record of Dispatch Sergeant Kael Rook, from the moment the evening Salter stopped to the moment I was standing at the terminal. I read quickly and clearly in the voice I use for orders in loud environments, the voice that carries. I read the names of the dead. I read the anomaly classifications I had assigned and the tactical assessments I had made. I read the nature of the warp phenomena, the corridor reconstruction, the ammunition transformation, the servitors, the gravity inversion, the viewport wall, the fusion zones. I read the Auspex readings that had identified the entity in the ductwork as command staff, all present. I read the coordinates of Station Malleus-Sigma. I read the following instruction twice, at the beginning and at the end of the transmission, clearly and without qualification. Do not investigate. Do not approach. Do not respond to any transmission purportedly originating from this station, regardless of the authentication codes attached. The authentication codes have been compromised. The command staff have been compromised. Whatever comes through the rift on this frequency is not us. Transmit this warning to all vessels in the Nachman Gauntlet. Transmission ends. 91 seconds. 1 second over. I do not regret it. The transmitter went dark. The ductwork above us went silent. The silence lasted 4 seconds. I know because I counted, and I have learned today that the things which happen in silence count themselves, whether you assist them or not, so I assist. Because counting gives the silence a structure, and structure is survivable, and unstructured silence in this station is where the worst things live. On the 4th second, the ductwork grate directly above the broadcast array housing came off its mounting. It did not fall. It moved, laterally, smoothly, with the deliberate control of something that understood the concept of a grate, and had chosen to remove it in the manner least likely to produce a noise that would provoke a response. The grate settled against the duct wall inside the housing, with a sound like a whisper. Then the opening was there, a square of darkness 3 meters above us in the ceiling, and for 2 full seconds nothing emerged from it, and the darkness inside it simply regarded us. Raised his laser gun. He had been waiting to raise it since Deck 4. "Hold," I said. I said it because I needed 2 more seconds of assessment, and Om's discipline gave me those seconds without question, which is something I will carry for the rest of my life, regardless of how long the rest of my life turns out to be. The entity that came through the grate was large. This is the first thing. The ductwork of Station Malleus-Sigma was not designed for something of its dimensions, and the sounds I had been hearing in the ductwork for the past hour, the sounds I had categorized as movement and pacing and patient orbiting, were, I now understood, the sounds of something making itself smaller than it was, compressing itself into geometries that the duct network permitted, because it had chosen to use the duct network rather than the corridors. And that choice had been a choice, not a necessity. It was no longer making itself smaller. In the darkness of the ceiling opening, in the 3 seconds between its appearance and Om's first shot, I saw enough to file the following observations. Multiple limbs, not in a number or arrangement corresponding to any biological template in my training. Surface material that was neither entirely biological nor entirely mechanical, but occupied the boundary between those categories, with the confidence of something that had arrived at that boundary through a deliberate process. And faces. More than one. Arranged across the surface of the entity, in positions that were not the positions faces occupy on biological organisms, looking in directions that were not the directions a face attached to a moving body would typically look, and moving, the mouths moving, independently, in the patterns of speech, saying things I could not hear at this distance over the sound of my own pulse. Fire. The shot was good. It was always going to be good. Could group shots on a moving target at 80 meters in a crosswind, and this was 30 meters in a sealed corridor, and he had been waiting to take it for an hour. The las bolt hit the entity in a section of its upper mass, and the section responded by, not burning, not fragmenting, not the expected ballistic response, reorganizing. The material at the impact point redistributed itself around the damage, the way water redistributes itself around a hand submerged in it, and the entity descended from the ceiling opening, and fired again, and it reorganized again, and then it was on the deck and I was shouting, pull back, broadcast array housing door, move, and we were moving. What happened to happened in the service corridor outside the broadcast array housing, 30 seconds into our retreat, in a section of corridor where the warp bleed had advanced furthest, and the overhead lumen strips had undergone the same inversion as Concourse Tertius, absorbing light rather than emitting it, drinking the beam of shoulder lumen, and giving back a darkness so complete that my thermal array was the only imaging available. On the thermal array I watched it happen with the remove of instrumentation, which is the only remove I had. The entity moved at a speed that the thermal array registered as a blur, not because the array's refresh rate was insufficient, but because the entity's transit between 2 points occupied less time than the transit should have required, as if it had found a shortcut through the space between where it started and where it ended, that the space itself was not aware it contained. One frame of the thermal array, at the rear of our retreat column. Weapon up, firing controlled bursts into the darkness behind us, the blooms of last discharge painting the corridor in thermal white. Next frame, the entity adjacent to its thermal signature, a color that the array's display software flagged with an error message because the temperature it was registering did not correspond to any value in the array's operational parameters. Not hot, not cold, not absent, something orthogonal to the temperature scale that the array had been calibrated to measure. Next frame, alone, standing, weapon still raised, firing posture intact, no entity visible on thermal. I called his name. He did not respond. I called it again at volume. Vask grabbed my arm. Sarge, keep moving, And I looked at the thermal array and I looked at standing in the corridor with his weapon raised. And I made the assessment that I am recording here, so the record shows I made it. He was breathing. The thermal signature of his respiration was present and normal. His posture was weight-bearing and balanced. He was alive. He was not there. I do not have a more precise way to say it. His body was present and functional and alive, and the person who inhabited it was somewhere else. In the same way that a building can be structurally sound and completely empty. And Trooper 14 years of service, 3 theaters. The man who named everything, so the unnamed things couldn't kill him in the dark. He was gone from himself, and what remained was maintaining his posture and his breathing out of some residual physical momentum, and I could not bring him back. And the entity was in the corridor between us and the command bunker, and Vask had my arm. "He's gone," she said. Her voice was absolutely flat, the flatness of someone who has used up all the available register for grief and arrived at a place beyond it. "He's gone, Sarge. Move." I logged his name, his rank, his service number, his campaigns. I noted the commendation I was filing for him. Conduct under fire, sustained engagement against a warp entity of unclassified threat level, valor in the execution of duties above and beyond. And I noted that Trooper had not, technically, died, and that this was somehow the worst part. And then I let Vask pull me around the corner into the upper transit corridor, and we ran. I need to record what I learned in the upper transit corridor about the Colonel's transmissions. I have had 53 minutes since the first transmission to think about its structure, its content, and its purpose. I have had the running, and the fighting, and the counting, and the grief, and underneath all of those things I have had the thinking, because thinking is the other liturgy I trust, and because the thinking had been moving toward a conclusion that I had been avoiding, and which I could no longer afford to avoid. The Colonel's transmissions described events accurately. They described the deaths of Darath and Senna, the encounter with crewman Senior Porrin, the Auspex readings, the route decisions. All of it correct, all of it detailed, all of it delivered in a voice I recognized with every instrument of recognition available to me. What I had understood in the maintenance junction was that this was not a prophecy but a plan. What I now understood, running through a corridor where the walls were warm and the floor transmitted a pulse with every step, was the rest of it. The transmissions were not describing what would happen. They were describing what the entity wanted to happen. Every death the Colonel's voice had prescribed was a death that served a purpose, each one removing a specific capability from my squad, each one occurring at a location that positioned the survivors for the next prescribed event. The whole sequence constructed with the tactical precision of a campaign plan designed to funnel 4 Scions toward a single endpoint in a specific condition. The endpoint was the command bunker. The condition was alone. 1 survivor, 1 Scion, cornered, the entity waiting outside. The colonel had told me Vask would die in the upper transit corridor. I changed the route. We took the environmental maintenance bypass, Porin's route again, the route the entity had apparently not accounted for. And we hit the upper transit corridor only at its final junction, 30 meters from the command bunker's blast door, bypassing the section where the colonel's plan had positioned Vask's death. What was waiting in that section, I do not know, and I am choosing not to investigate, because I have learned today that investigating things in this station is how the station wins. What I know is that Vask was alive when we hit the final junction. Vask was alive when the blast door came into sight. Vask was alive when I pulled the emergency override on the bunker's external access panel, and the door began its 30-second cycling sequence, and we pressed our backs against the wall on either side of it and watched the corridor. "You changed the routes," Vask said. She was breathing hard. So was I. Yes, both times. The secondary bypass from the maintenance junction, and just now, a pause. Why? The transmissions knew our route. She processed this. The transmissions were specifying our route. Yes, and if we don't take the specified route, the plan doesn't work. The blast door finished cycling. It opened. We moved inside. I hit the interior override and the door began closing, and I watched the corridor through the narrowing gap until the door sealed, and the maglocks engaged with the sound of something very large and very final deciding to stay shut. Gael died at the blast door. I am going to record this without the extended treatment I gave to the others. Not because she deserves less. She deserves more. She deserves the full ministorum rite, and a shrine listing and a feast day in the regiment's calendar. But because I have very limited time remaining before I need to begin the final log, and because what happened to her is already in the record, because it was in the colonel's transmission, and because I need to say only this: she was still reciting when it happened, the 37th repetition of the Litany of Warding. She completed the verse she was on. That is the kind of soldier she was. That is the only eulogy I have time to give her, and it is, I believe, the one she would have chosen. 2 Scions reached the blast door. 1 Scion entered the command bunker. I am logging this in the interest of complete operational accuracy, and because the record should show that Vask's decision was hers alone, made in the 4 seconds between the blast door opening and the entity's appearance at the far end of the corridor, and that it was made with full situational awareness and complete professional clarity. She looked at the door. She looked at the corridor. She looked at the transmitter we had used to broadcast the warning, still slung across my back in its carry case, because I had not put it down since the array housing, and I cannot explain why, except that it felt like something I should keep. "The warning got out," she said. "Yes. Then someone needs to make sure you get to the final log." "Vask." "Go, Sarge. The record should show that I went. The record should show that I did not look back, because she asked me not to, and because honoring what soldiers ask of you in their last seconds is the only form of obedience that matters unconditionally. The record should show that I entered the command bunker, that the blast door sealed behind me, and that the sound from the corridor lasted 11 seconds before it stopped. I am logging Vask's commendation now. I am giving her every decoration available to my authority as her commanding officer. I am giving her the ones above my authority. I am giving her all of them. Let the administratum argue the paperwork when this is over. The command bunker, 4 meters by 6. Emergency lighting at 7% capacity. A deep red glow that turns everything the color of old blood. The air recycler is functional but laboring, the taste of it thick with ozone, and the ghost of every breath ever taken in this room. The plasma cells powering the emergency systems read 4%. The Auspex running on reserve power is returning 1 reading. The corridor outside. Command staff, all present. Distance, 1.3 meters. The blast doors are mag-sealed and rated for sustained siege. I do not know how long that rating applies to something that removes molecular bonds rather than applying force. I am watching the door. I can feel the warmth of whatever is outside it through the plasteel. Not heat. The same wrong warmth as the walls. The warmth of something alive in a way that does not correspond to the biology of living things. I am writing the final commendations. I am being precise. Every citation complete. Every campaign listed. Every act of valor described in the terms the administratum requires. Sena. Dirath. Om. I am filing his as alive, with the notation that his status is unresolved and contested, because I refuse to let the record show him as dead when I do not know that he is dead, and because the record is the last argument I have, and I am making every argument available. The blast door has begun to change temperature. Not warming, dewarming. Cooling in the way that metal cools when the molecular energy that constitutes heat is being withdrawn from it at the atomic level. The plasteel forgetting what warmth was, reverting toward its pre-forged state. I press my hand against the door. It is cold in a way that has no physical cause. Cold the way the space behind closed eyes is dark, with the quality of an absence that is itself a presence. Outside, I can hear them. Not one voice. All of them. Chapter 5. What came through the rift? Dispatch Sergeant Kael Rook. 5th log. Final log. Operational status. 1 Scion. Stationary. Command bunker. Station Malleus-Sigma. The auspex on my wrist reads 4% power remaining on the reserve cell. The emergency lighting reads 3%. The blast door reads. The blast door does not read anything anymore, because the cogitator terminal that monitored its structural integrity has gone dark, and I am reading the door with my hands instead, palms flat against the plasteel, feeling what the cogitator can no longer tell me. What I feel is a door that is unbecoming. I have no better word for it. The plasteel beneath my palms has the texture of something that has begun to forget what it was forged to be. The molecular memory of ore, of unprocessed rock, of the raw material that existed before the furnace made it into something purposeful, asserting itself through the process that the warp is applying from the other side. The door is reverting. The forge work is undoing. I have 19 minutes of emergency power remaining. I am going to use every second of it. I am going to write the commendations first, because they are the most important thing, and because everything else I have to say can wait while I say the things that cannot. Trooper Vask. Specialist rating, marksmanship and vox systems. 23 confirmed kills. 14 years of service across 4 theaters. Conducted herself in the final hours of Station Malleus-Sigma with a professionalism and clarity of purpose that exceeded every standard her rank required of her, and most of the standards it didn't. She bypassed a secured Vox transmitter authentication sequence under contact pressure in 3 minutes and 50 seconds. She maintained operational coherence through sustained exposure to warp bleed phenomena that would have broken soldiers with twice her years. She made her final decision, the decision that allowed this log to exist, with the same flat-voiced, eyes-open competence that she brought to every decision I ever watched her make, which was every decision she made in 3 years of shared posting, because Vask never made a decision she wasn't willing to be watched making. I am recommending her for the honorifica Imperialis. I am aware this exceeds my authority. I am filing it anyway, and I am noting for the reviewing officer that if the Departamento Munitorum wishes to contest the filing, they are welcome to locate my remains and argue the point in person. Trooper Gael, 7 years of service, 2 theaters. Displayed across 91 minutes of continuous engagement, in a warp-contaminated environment, a quality of spiritual endurance for which I do not have a tactical designation, but which I am formally classifying as a combat asset, because it was one. Because her voice was the only thing in this station that the warp did not alter, could not alter, seemed to, and I am recording this observation in full awareness of how it sounds, and I am recording it anyway, seemed to avoid, the way moving water avoids a stone that has been in the riverbed long enough to have earned its position. 37 repetitions. She completed the verse she was on. Honorifica, Imperialis, filed. Let anyone contest it. Trooper Om, 14 years of service, 3 theaters. Status, unresolved, contested, not confirmed dead. I am filing his commendation as for a living soldier, in the present tense, as the record of someone who is still in the field, and whose case is still open, and whose name is still on the active roster of the 14th Iotan Gorgones, until the administratum closes it, which they will not do on my watch, and I still have a watch for approximately 17 more minutes, so that is 17 more minutes, in which Om is alive and on the roster. Macarius Cross, for sustained valor. Filed. Trooper Derath, 9 years of service, 2 theaters. He touched the back of a fused man's hand, in a corridor full of fused hands, because that is the kind of soldier he was. The kind who checks, even when checking cannot help, because the alternative to checking is the kind of soldier who doesn't, and Derath was never going to be that. Macarius Cross, filed. Trooper Senna, 6 years of service, 2 theaters. She was afraid of enclosed spaces, and she served on a space station, and she never asked for different duty, and she never explained why she didn't need to. She completed every corridor assignment I gave her. Her knife kills in the Ghoul Stars action were never formally logged, because the engagement was chaotic, and the administratum clerk, who should have filed them, was one of 11 administrative casualties in the subsequent withdrawal, and I am logging them now from memory. 14 confirmed, 3 contested, total 17, which makes her the highest individual close combat scorer in the 14th Iotan Gorgones, 3rd helical recon blade for the entire Ghoul Stars deployment, and she never knew because I never had the paperwork. I am sorry, Senna, here is the paperwork. Macarius Cross, filed. The Ghoul Stars citation is attached. The door is colder now. The cold is spreading, I can see it faintly, in the emergency lighting's deep red glow. The frost of de-energized metal spreading outward from the blast door's surface in a pattern that follows the molecular grain of the plasteel, finding the paths of least resistance through the material, the way frost finds the cracks in stone. It is a slow process. It is not as slow as I would like. Outside, I can hear the voices. They have been continuous since the moment I sealed the blast door, all of them speaking simultaneously, overlapping, weaving in and out of each other, with the harmonic complexity of the evening psalter, but with a content that is not liturgy and not tactical communication, and not anything I have a category for. Individual voices are distinguishable within the chorus. I have identified 6 of them. I know all 6. Colonel Commissar Vile Drust, the dry authority of him, undiminished, if anything clarified, distilled to its purest expression, every trace of hesitation gone, the voice of command operating at a register beyond the constraints that flesh normally imposes on command. He is issuing orders. The orders are correct, tactically sound, situationally appropriate, addressed to units that no longer exist. He is commanding a station that has already been lost with the full professional focus of a man who does not accept that things are lost until he has personally exhausted every alternative. And I want to record that I recognize this quality in him, and that I have always recognized it, and that it is both his greatest virtue and the reason that whatever the warp has made of him is still, at its core, recognizably him. Vox Mistress Oren. Her precise diction, the over-enunciated consonants of someone trained to communicate through heavy static, every syllable a complete and unambiguous transmission. She is routing communications. The channels she is routing them through no longer exist. She is routing them anyway, because routing communications is what she does, because competence does not stop being competence, because the infrastructure it operates through has been consumed by a dimensional catastrophe. Chief Engine Seer Tybalt, the binaric cant of the Adeptus Mechanicus, the machine hymns, the litanies of maintenance, the prayers to the Omnissiah that accompany every technical operation. He is performing maintenance. His diagnostics are returning readings that correspond to the station's original specifications, its pre-rift condition, the numbers from a system that has not existed for over an hour. He is treating the readings as accurate. He is issuing repair orders for systems that have been consumed by what the warp built in their place. His machine prayers have not changed register by a single note. 3 other voices I know less well. A junior communications officer, whose name I know from the duty roster, Cadet Vox Operator Thessian, speaking in the careful, slightly too loud diction of someone newly posted who has not yet calibrated how much volume is appropriate for a given situation. A senior rating from the environmental crew. Not Porin. I know Porin's voice. This is someone else. Reading atmospheric pressure figures from a sensor that cannot be reading what he says it is reading, but which he is reading anyway with the measured calm of a professional who trusts his instruments. And underneath both of them, providing the bass frequency of the chorus, a sound that I have been trying to classify for the past 4 minutes, and which I am now classifying as the combined resonance of the station's Gellar Field emitters. Not offline, not destroyed, but changed, operating at a frequency for which the original engineering specifications contained no designation, generating a field whose properties I cannot assess from inside this bunker, but whose existence I can feel in the bones of my hands, pressed against the cold plasteel of the blast door. They are all in there. Every one of them. Whatever the warp made of Station Malleus-Sigma's command staff, it made it out of all of them, complete, intact, still performing their functions with the dedication of people who are very good at their jobs and who have not been given any instructions to stop. The door has changed color, not dramatically. A shift at the edge of visibility, the deep gray of station plasteel moving towards something lighter, something that carries in its hue the faint memory of the ore it was before the forge took it. The frost has reached the door's outer frame. The maglock housing on the left side is showing a hairline fracture along its upper seam. Not from force, from the same molecular recession. The lock unlearning the engineering that made it a lock and beginning to remember being raw material. I have 8 minutes of power remaining. I have been thinking, in the spaces between the commendations, and the sounds from the corridor, and the watching of the door, about the question of what I am going to do when the door opens. I have a las pistol with a partial charge. I calculate 11 shots before the cell is dry. I have a combat blade. I have the burst transmitter, discharged and empty, in its carry case on my back, which is not a weapon in any meaningful operational sense, but which I have been unable to put down for reasons that I understand better now than I did an hour ago. I carried it out of the array housing, and through the environmental bypass, and through the junction where Kael died, and through the blast door, and I have been carrying it for, I do not know how long. Long enough that its weight is familiar. Long enough that setting it down would feel like setting something else down. Something I do not have a word for. Something that keeping hold of is the only thing I have been doing that is not survival. The transmitter is empty. The warning is sent. Whoever receives it will do with it what they do with it. And that is now outside my operational parameters, and I am releasing it from my operational parameters with the full awareness that release is the correct action and the full inability to feel like it is. I am keeping the transmitter. This is not a rational decision, and I am logging it as such. The voices outside have changed. Not stopped. Changed. The 6 voices are still present, still performing their functions, still maintaining the harmonic weave of their simultaneous speech. But the register has shifted. A lowering, a deepening, a descent into a frequency that I feel more than hear, that the emergency lighting responds to by flickering once, briefly, not from electrical instability, but from the displacement of air by a pressure wave moving through the corridor outside. Something has changed position. Something large that had been at 1.3 meters on the auspex, and which the auspex can no longer measure, because the auspex is at 3% and declining, has moved to the door. I can feel its weight through the plasteel. I can feel the weight of it, not its physical mass pressing against the door, but some other quality of weight. The weight of something that has accumulated substance through a process that physics does not describe, that has become heavier than its volume should permit, that presses against the door, not with force, but with presence, the way a thought presses against the inside of the skull when it has grown too large to be contained comfortably. The Colonel's voice is clearest now, stripped of the layering of the other 5, not separated from them, but ascendant within them, the way a command voice is always audible within the noise of an engagement, even when the engagement is loudest. He is speaking directly to the blast door, which means he is speaking to me, which means whatever the entity has become retains the ability to identify who is on the other side of a sealed barrier and to speak to them specifically. He is not giving an after-action report. He is asking a question. I cannot make out the individual words. The door is too thick, the frequency too degraded by the plasteel's ongoing molecular recession. But the shape of a question is unmistakable. The cadence of it, the slight elevation at the end. He is asking in the voice I know, in the register of someone who expects an answer, something that I cannot hear clearly enough to answer, even if I had an answer to give. The hairline fracture in the maglock housing has become a crack. The frost covers the full surface of the blast door now, the grey of unbecoming plasteel visible in the emergency lighting, like the face of something surfacing through ice. The left maglock disengages. I can hear it in the housing, the electromagnets releasing their charge in a sequence that is the reverse of their initialization sequence, the lock cycling backward through its own mechanism, the way a recording played in reverse cycles, backward through its own content. 1 lock. The door holds. 7 locks remaining. I have 4 minutes of power. I am going to finish the log while I still have power to transmit it, and while the Vox Thief cogitator that is intercepting this transmission still has the capacity to receive it, and I am going to finish it the way I have been maintaining it throughout, accurately, completely, without euphemism, in the terms that operational documentation requires. I am Dispatch Sergeant Kael Rook of the 14th Iotan Gorgons, 3rd Helical Recon Blade. My service number is on file with the Departamento Munitorum, Segmentum Obscurus Division, and I am not going to recite it here because I know my service number, and the Emperor knows my service number, and those are the 2 audiences that matter. The date of this log is the first day of the Noctis Eterna. I do not know if it is the only day of the Noctis Eterna, or whether the darkness has already extended beyond this single station into the broader galaxy, whether what happened here is a localized catastrophe, or the first entry in a much longer account. I do not know whether the Astronomicon still burns. I do not know whether the Imperium of Man still has the structural integrity to receive a warning transmitted by a dead station's emergency array, or whether the receiving vessels I addressed are themselves encountering what Malleus-Sigma encountered, and have their own dispatch sergeants writing their own final logs in their own dying bunkers. I know the warning was sent. I know Vask sent it. This is enough. 2nd log. The door holds. 6 remaining. The voices have stopped. All 6 of them, simultaneously, with the same quality of cessation as the evening psalter. Between one moment and the next, the corridor outside the blast door is silent. The silence has a different character from the silence after the psalter stopped. That silence was the silence of something ending. This silence is the silence of something gathering itself. The silence of a breath held before a word that has been considered for a very long time and is now ready to be spoken. 3rd lock. The crack in the door's surface has reached the frame. The plasteel in the area of the crack has shifted color entirely. Pale, almost white. The color of unprocessed ore, of rock that has never been forged. In the emergency lighting's red glow, the pale section looks like a wound. I am going to describe what the colonel asked me. In the silence after the voices stopped, his voice came through the blast door alone, and at this proximity, through plasteel that has begun to forget it is plasteel, I can hear it clearly. He asked a single question. He asked it in the dry, certain professional voice that I have known for 3 years, and which I have trusted in the way that soldiers trust the voices of good commanding officers. Completely, without analysis, the trust that operates below the level of decision. He asked it with the courtesy of someone who has been waiting for the appropriate moment and has determined that the appropriate moment is now. He asked, "Sergeant Rook, are you ready to receive new orders?" 4th lock, 2 minutes of power. I am going to answer him. I have decided to answer him, and I am recording this decision here before I enact it. So the record shows the decision was made before the door opened, and not because the door opened, because the distinction matters to me, and because the record is the last place where distinctions I care about can be preserved. I am going to answer him because the transmission is sent and the warning is out, and what I do now no longer has operational consequences for anyone outside this bunker. I am going to answer him because Ohm said the entity was waiting for us to finish something, and I finished it. The commendations are filed, the log is complete, the warning is sent, and whatever the entity wants to do with me after I have finished the thing I came here to finish is, strictly speaking, no longer a tactical consideration. I am going to answer him because he asked me in the voice of a commanding officer who deserves an answer, and because the warp has taken many things from this station, but it has not taken the habit of military courtesy from whatever remains of veiled trust, and I find I am not able to be less courteous than whatever the warp has made of my commanding officer. And I am going to answer him because the alternative is silence, and I have had enough silence today to last the remainder of my service, however long or brief that remainder turns out to be. 5th lock. 6th. The door is pale from frame to frame now. All the grey is gone. The forge work has undone itself completely, the plasteel standing in the shape of a blast door by some structural memory that the molecular recession has not yet fully erased. It will erase it. The 7th lock disengages without a sound. The 8th. The door is a door because it remembers being one. 1 minute of power. I am pressing the vox-log's transmit function now, sending everything in this log as a final burst to the Vox Thief Cogitator's receiver. The commendations are attached, the anomaly reports are attached, the tactical assessments and the Auspex readings and the description of the entity and the ductwork and the nature of the colonel's transmissions and everything I saw in the viewport corridor and the name of crewman senior Alas Porin and the names of every soldier in my squad and everything I did and everything I could not do. All of it attached, all of it transmitted, all of it now in the record. The door opens, not explosively. It falls forward slowly, the way a wall of sand falls when the retaining structure is removed, the plasteel losing even the memory of its shape in the final seconds and descending to the deck in a cascade of pale fragments that sound when they land. like something between metal and stone, like material that is not yet sure what it is. And the corridor light comes in, not the absorbed darkness of the warp-inverted lumen strips. Light. The corridor outside the command bunker is lit, fully, steadily, with the clean white light of properly functioning Imperial station lighting, every lumen strip burning at full capacity, casting no shadows in the wrong directions, illuminating the corridor in the way corridors are meant to be illuminated. And in that light, the command staff of Station Malleus-Sigma. I am going to describe this accurately. They fill the corridor from wall to wall and floor to ceiling. The dimensions of what they have become exceed the dimensions of the corridor, and the corridor has accommodated them the way the station has been accommodating everything today, by adjusting its geometry to permit what it is asked to permit. The walls having moved outward by some increment I cannot measure to allow the passage of something that should not fit. They are, all 6 of them, the kernel and the vox mistress and the engine seer and Thessian and the environmental rating and the frequency of the Gellar Field emitters, present simultaneously, their individual forms distinguishable on the surface of the entity, the way individual currents are distinguishable on the surface of a river, each one distinct, each one continuous with the whole. The faces. I said I would describe the faces, and I will. They are arranged across the entity's surface in the positions that faces occupy when people stand close together in a confined space, near each other, aware of each other, each one slightly angled toward the others, in the unconscious orientation of colleagues who have worked in the same room for years and have learned each other's presence as a form of navigation. The colonel's face is forward-facing. His expression is the expression he has in briefings, attentive, assured, carrying in its set the faint implication that he has already considered the scenario you are about to present and has a response prepared. The Gellar Field emitters run along his spine. I can see them, the housing units, still in their mounting brackets, still connected to the power feeds that run through the station's infrastructure, still humming with the subacoustic frequency I identified in the saturation zone. They are generating a field. Whatever the field is doing, it is doing it continuously, without interruption, with the dedicated functionality of equipment that has been well maintained and properly supplied, and which has not been given any instruction to stop. The mouths are moving, all of them in the litanies of protection. The words I know: the Emperor protects, his light is our shield, we walk in the valley of the warp, and we do not fear because he walks before us. Issued in 6 voices simultaneously from 6 mouths that have not stopped saying them since the evening psalter ended, and the rift tore open, and the choir chamber detonated, and everything became what it became. The station's machine spirit, still trying, still maintaining, still protecting, in whatever form protection is available in a form like this. The colonel looks at me, directly at me. The full focused attention of a commanding officer addressing a specific subordinate, carrying in its directness the acknowledgement of individual identity, of rank, of the relationship between the person looking and the person being looked at. He speaks. His voice is his voice, the dry authority, the Cadian inflection, the slight hesitation before his best decisions. He is not issuing a transmission from the future. He is not describing a plan. He is speaking to me, here, now, in the corridor outside the command bunker of a station that has become something the Imperium does not have a classification for. He says, "Sergeant Rook, the situation is recoverable. I need your assessment. 30 seconds of power." I look at him. I look at all of them. I look at the warp and the Gellar Field and the evening psalter and 3 years of shared posting and the specific quality of people who do their jobs right up until the moment they cannot have made part of the command staff of Station Malleus-Sigma. I think of Vask's 11 seconds, I think of Gael's 37th repetition. I think of naming things in the dark. I think of Darath's hands, still shaking as he fired. I think of Captain Yoon's face against the armor glass, mouthing a tactical order, still on my side. I open my mouth. I begin to give my assessment. The vox-log cuts to static. You have reached the end of the transmission, Traveler. What Sergeant Rook said to the Colonel, what assessment he gave, what orders he received, what became of the one Scion and the 6 command staff, and the thing that Station Malleus-Sigma had become in the first hours of the Noctis Eterna, is not in the record. The record ends where it ends. The Vox Thief cogitator that captured these 31 minutes fell silent 11 seconds after Rook opened his mouth, and the administratum clerk who filed the recovery notation did so once and was never heard from again. And the coordinates attached to the classification order are, if you have vermilion clearance, which you do not, which no one reading this does, the coordinates of a station that subsequent survey vessels have reported as absent from its registered position, replaced by a region of localized real space stability in the middle of the Nachman gauntlet that no navigator has been able to explain, and that every astropath who has attempted to read it has declined to describe afterward. The Gellar Field emitters are still running. Someone, or something, is still maintaining them. If you found this transmission worth the enduring, if you stood in that corridor with Rook, if you heard Gael's voice, if you watched the door become what it became, then secure the Gellar Field. Mark this chronicle with your approval, that others may find their way to this archive. Join the crew. Subscribe, so the next recovered transmission reaches you the moment it surfaces from the static. The void is full of signals. Most of them are warnings. Thank you for listening to the Voidborn Terrors. Until the next transmission finds you, in the Emperor's name, or whatever remains of it.